Okay.
What do you see?
I think we're live, Josh. And I think yes. So I believe that our vast listening and viewing audience is actually seeing and hearing us. Now, assuming we have the technology under control, which will remain touch and go possibly for the rest of the hour. So anyway, hi, Josh.
Hey, Bob. Welcome to the audience.
Yes. Thank you for being here. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. You're Josh Summers, podcaster, yoga teacher, sage, guru. Stop me when I've gone too far.
You've gone way too far.
Okay. So podcaster, yoga
Just
teacher.
Stop at guru.
Stop after guru. Yeah, well,
sage is over the top.
Okay. You're Josh Summers. I'm Robert Wright. As I think I said that. So we're having a conversation. Welcome to everyone who's listening live, for starters, on YouTube. Welcome to everyone who will listen later on YouTube, and everyone who will listen on the Wright Show audio podcast. So this is the second conversation that you and I have had. So it's we had one last week at this time. So it's second in a series that is of unknown duration. That is to say, we're not sure whether we're going to keep having these conversations, and if so, what the scope will be. And we're going to talk about that tonight at some point. We've talked about it a little, and I have some ideas, you have some ideas, and we'll share them, and we welcome feedback. And of course, we'll also talk concretely about the things we said we'd talk about tonight: cognitive empathy, mindfulness, how all this applies to politics and to your own, mental health. And we'll get into a lot of stuff. Let me quickly recap how these conversations started. They literally began tragically. Tragically is a word that's used loosely, but in this case, they began with the death, I think exactly a month ago, of Michael Brooks, well-known journalist and internet broadcaster. I knew Michael a little, had been on his show. He'd been on my show. You knew him better than I did, had known him longer than I had been a collaborator of his and a co-author of his. As it happened, a few days before he died, he had emailed me, said, want to do a live stream on cognitive empathy and reactive politics. I said, sure. We were scheduled to go, and then we lost him. And then one of his fans suggested on Twitter that I go ahead and do a live stream on cognitive empathy, either alone or with somebody. I reached out to you. As a consequence of that, Michael's mother joined us in last week's conversation, Donna. And for my money, that's the best part of the conversation. If people haven't seen it, just search for my name, Josh's name on YouTube, and it's the August 13th conversation. Donna shows up about 35 minutes into it. So it was a great conversation, but a lot was left unsaid about cognitive empathy and related matters. Because I think you and I agree that once you start thinking about cognitive empathy, which we'll describe for those who weren't with us, but it connects to a lot of things. You wind up talking about mindfulness, which was a shared interest of yours and mine and Michael's. You actually met me and Michael independently in meditation retreats, and all kinds of other subjects come into play. And, I did want to play, and I hope this will be audible. I'm using crude technology, namely my smartphone, but there's this riff that Michael did the night before he died that a lot of us kind of circulated on Twitter. But he uses the word empathy. He's not talking about cognitive empathy exclusively by any means, but I think he gives you a hint of how many things fit into a kind of a unified conversation, including the subject of empathy, and I'll get into that. So I hope this is reasonably audible.
What does it actually mean to be truly global to the extent we can, local, national, and international simultaneously, east, west, north, south, but from a place of actual growth and empathy? And this is where, again, this questions of consciousness come in. The questions of cultivating empathy, cultivating compassion, cultivating awareness, the complete antithesis of social media modes. Long-term thinking, compassion, seeing complexity, comfort with oneself, solitude, the opposite of instant gratification, the attempt to constantly humanize and not dehumanize your fellow humans. These are all completely countervailing forces to the market technologic that subsumes all of us today. What does it actually mean to be truly global to the extent we can, local, national, and international?
Okay, that's the beginning again. So, I can imagine. I mean, to me, all the various things he's touched on do seem logically connected. I mean, I think the question of cognitive empathy and more familiar kind of empathy, emotional empathy, are very much related to the idea of, building a better planet, of a global consciousness, of building a better politics nationally and locally as well. And the thing he said about social media is interesting because I think the suggestion there is that it has bad effects, not only at the individual level, at the level of kind of individual sanity and mental health, but also at the level of the social system. And I very much agree with that. As for what he said at the end about capitalism, I'm not as far left as Michael was. I'm not a socialist, but it's certainly true that capitalism, notwithstanding any virtues it may have, does work to get us addicted to various unhealthy things, including unhealthy things on the internet, including social media, and these algorithms that are designed to maximize profit seem to be largely pernicious. So I guess, Josh, I imagine all of these things and more being good candidates for continued conversation between you and me. There's more I could say about that, but maybe I'll hold off and just see what you want to add, if anything, and where you want to take the conversation.
Yeah, the thing that I would just jump in with is, I think in light of Michael's death, and I've been thinking about this in the last few days, especially in light of our conversations. He was a close friend of mine, and as I said in my podcast tribute to him, I quoted Martin Amis, who was talking about Christopher Hitchens. When Christopher Hitchens passed away, Amos said, "When your best friends die, they bequeath to you their love of life, and it becomes your solemn duty to love life the way they loved life because they're no longer there." And I've personally been fairly quiet in my world. Like I've been quietly teaching meditation and yoga and engaging with those practices on that level. But I saw Michael in a way going for something. His heart was fully steaming straight ahead for his vision. And I think, in the time that I've known you, I've seen a development in kind of the way you conceive of and diagnose what's going on at both macro and micro level. And I think you have a pretty interesting worldview that intersects nicely with elements of the Dharma. And I mean, I use that word very gently to refer to kind of a spiritual orientation and a path in life. And I think that's part of the motivating thing for me having a conversation with you, is to explore that intersection of the Dharma with psychology and politics, and get your frame of the diagnosis and potential cures more clearly expressed in terms of sort of this distribution in a listenership and operating in people's minds, of trying to see these lenses. Because last night I wrote down, a good writer, and this is not rocket science to say, but a good writer is capable of changing your worldview. They can literally open up a new way of seeing the world. And it took me, spent 4 minutes doing this, but I listed down your books, and I made a little note on how each book kind of changed or altered my worldview. And, you know, that's no small, sorry for you know, I thought we could actually, if these conversations continue, we can have, you know, listeners share their own experience of how your books have changed their worldview. And
I'm not sure how many there are who have anything to say on that subject, but
we could add a special element that the more backhanded the compliment was, that the more likely we would share it or we tweet about it.
I'm all for backhanded compliments.
Well,
anyway, I'm flattered that you were able to compile a list. I mean, I've helped you out by not writing many books in the course of my life, made it easier. But
my only backhand remark was going to be that, you know, your 4 books each changed my worldview to some degree, and I only had to read about 1 or 2 of them. So.
Okay, you're reading the reviews. We'll do on the rest. So I guess I would say, I mean, before we dive into concrete stuff, and then maybe at the end, come back to the question of where exactly this conversation can head. I mean, I agree with you. I am personally, needless to say, a fan of my worldview. I do think I could do a better job of articulating it and making it user friendly. And if I could have conversations that help me do that, that would be great. The one thing I feel conviction about is that, you know, you mentioned the diagnosis and the cure. The one thing I feel conviction about, is that there is a parallel between the individual level and the societal level of diagnosis and of cure. In other words, there's a sense in which by saving yourself, you can save the world, or by preserving, restoring your mental health, you can build a healthier world and a healthier nation. You know, you can be a happier, better, more fulfilled person, and in the process create a better world. I really believe that. And I mean, it sounds like a cliche, but it's not necessarily true. And in fact, you can certainly imagine a universe in which it wouldn't be true. You know, you can imagine a world where the two are exactly inversely correlated, and the happiest, most fulfilled people are the people who are doing the most damage to the world. And look, there are definitely a lot of happy people who are doing a lot of damage to the world, and that is part of the problem we face. And the world does often give material and social rewards to people who are damaging it. I mean, that's just, there's evidence everywhere around. Still, I do think that by focusing on the body of ideas that you and I share an interest in, and I know Michael shared an interest in, you can reconcile personal progress, personal growth, personal happiness with the betterment of the world. I'm a firm believer in that, and I do think convincing people of that and enabling them to harness it, to actually make use of it, and, you know, providing practical examples and so on, and would be a worthy cause and something I need help on. I don't think I've done an adequate job of it, and maybe if it emerges in conversation, that would be great.
Yeah, that's part of what we're getting at. I think 2 caveats come to mind, or two things we should mention. One is that, you know, there's a way that a lot of the conversations and even the voices that address sort of the integration of the development of consciousness or spirituality within the world of politics, it can carry with it a whiff of sanctimony, a tone of preciousness that I think we both share a little bit of difficulty, if not a hindrance of aversion around. And so part of what interests me about talking to you about this is I think we can keep it open in a very real way. And even though we value these things and we're practitioners, I think we can both be honest about how imperfect a practitioner we are. And
Oh, I won't have any trouble establishing that. By practitioner, you mean meditation practitioner, I take it, or practitioner of the Dharma.
yeah, one or both.
Yeah, and let me say, I don't think we're asking people in order to try to benefit from anything we have to say to become Buddhists or to buy into all of Buddhist philosophy. I'm a fan of Buddhist philosophy and the Buddhist conception of human psychology, but I think a lot of you don't have to buy it wholesale. You can take what we offer that's useful, and
Yeah, and in your worldview, I see the Dharma being just one tool of many to help navigate the complexity and challenges we're facing. It's not a panacea. And if anything, the thing I didn't get to say already was that I feel like, to blow up Bob a little bit more, like
I encourage. It depends on what you mean by blowing up. There's a sense in which I don't want to be blown up.
Or pump you up.
In which if you mean puff up, like puff up my ego, have at it. If you don't mean like detonate me.
I mean, the thing we're touching into is that there's something about this moment, this time right now that feels incredibly apocalyptic in a way. Mm-hmm. And so we're facing this existential issue. And, if the Dharma is to continue, I would suggest that it even necessitates onboarding elements of your worldview so that it's more engaged, because that's the other side of, say, the spiritual mind, which or the spiritual personality, which I'm guilty of myself, which is that it's easy to be kind of somewhat complacent, internal, non-engaging, and passive, have sort of a passive approach to life where you're not fully engaging with difficult conflictual things that are arising. And we're just at the point where that feels like it's no longer tenable.
Right. No, I have a pretty apocalyptic view. Let me pause, by the way, and do something maybe slightly crass and self-serving that I think Michael would applaud me for, because I learned it from him. He emailed me once, and he said, check this out. And what it was a recording of a live stream he had done as a monologue. Okay. He said, I'm curious what you think of this. And one thing I noticed, I'd never seen him do a monologue live stream, which first of all impresses me tremendously that you would have the courage to do that. But I noticed that he would say to people, smash the like button. Like if you're watching on Facebook, hit the like button. And the reason is it feeds the algorithm. So whether you're watching, live or watching later, it draws more people. So if you want to help us build audience, I encourage that. And I always feel like bad about being self-serving like that. But, one thing I learned from Michael is, damn it, if you believe in your cause, I mean, it's a jungle out there. There's people fighting for attention, and a lot of them are not people we consider good actors. And so you just ask people who wish you well to help. So on the, like people who want to help avert the apocalypse. I mean, I am apocalyptic. Well, go ahead.
Can you give a nutshell diagnosis
of the problem?
Yeah.
Well,
because you see cognitive empathy as part of the solution. And yes. We'll be discussing how strong of a solution or how therapeutic solution that will offer. But before we get into that, what is it that what are the driving forces or the core issues that are fueling the symptom of what you're feeling?
Okay, so let me at the risk of being self-indulgent, let me back up and talk just a little bit about this book I wrote called Non-Zero. I talked about it with Michael in the last live stream I did with him, where we mainly focused on the dangers of a Cold War with China, which also involves cognitive empathy. I mean, just quickly, cognitive empathy is just, it's not the same as like identifying with people's emotions, sharing their pain. It's just understanding their point of view, understanding. And I think, and I wrote a piece recently that made a point that I also made when I spoke with Michael, that, one misunderstanding, all of these people who are like agitating for a new Cold War with China, most of them don't understand how the average Chinese person looks at the world, or how, of course, there are lots of different perspectives over there, but a lot of them do not understand, that there's a lot of admiration and support for the leadership over there, in part because the leadership over the last several decades has radically increased living standards among the lower half, and B, all of these belligerent things Trump is doing. And I'm not saying there's no case in which we need to get tougher with China, fine, but there's a lot of gratuitous belligerence, and one thing a lot of people don't realize is that increases among many Chinese the degree of their support for the leadership. It strengthens nationalism. So that's just a concrete example of cognitive empathy, just helping you understand the situation. Just take the time, like read up on what people are thinking and doing in China. So I just wanted to give one quick. I felt by now we should give them another clearer definition of cognitive empathy. One application. That said, that's a tangent. So should I get back to my main like highway thing, or do you want to have something you want to say?
Well, no. Yeah, read up, and that's the question. Then becomes, for a general audience, and this is the question that cropped up in my head last week after we spoke. Is like, read up. Okay, where am I supposed to read? Where am I going to get that the Chinese populace take on how they feel about Xi Jinping?
Well, I try to draw attention. I put out a newsletter, non-zero newsletter, where this piece of mine in China appeared. I try to, we often put out a readings section in that, and I try to draw attention to pieces that facilitate cognitive empathy, to give you a perspective on what actors are thinking. Like in the early days of the what various actors are thinking of the Trump years, when I personally thought the resistance was just going overboard, being too reactive, taking too much of Trump's troll bait, and in a way strengthening his base by going berserk about everything he said, and by saying really unflattering things about his supporters. I used to call attention. I used to work hard to get people to understand like how Trump supporters, or at least some of them, are looking at things. And in fact, at that point, the newsletter was called the Mindful Resistance newsletter. But all that said, let me say, I think if we can develop if we move forward to this, develop an audience and a group of supporters, we should both try harder to draw their attention to things that can help them understand. I mean, that could be a regular feature. The perspective of someone somewhere in the world whose perspective you think is not understood.
Well, and I also think that, it's a very simple thing to observe, but this ties right back to the mention of social media and sort of the fragmentation, the acontextual, the siloed sources of information that people are getting, that it just makes it so much harder to find and figure out how to access.
It's worse than that. It's worse than just a silo. It's that within your silo, the people who will gain stature most surely are the people who will caricature and demonize the people in the opposing silo. So the easiest way to get a bunch of Twitter followers is to like say unflattering things about Trump supporters, ridicule, just find some hapless dolt, who does something stupid in a supermarket in the Midwest and act as if they're typical of all Trump supporters or something and ridicule them. And so the system, it's just, a term that naturally comes into play is the psychology of tribalism. I understand, by the way, why some people find the term tribalism offensive. It's not an easy substitute, but anyway, people know what I mean by that. It's just the psychology of groupishness and the psychology of identifying so intensely with your group that it warps your perception of the world and shuts off cognitive empathy systematically. And that's one thing to remember about cognitive empathy, is that human nature is, I think, designed to shut it down in certain circumstances. And sometimes those are the circumstances in which we most need to activate it. Because if you shut it down, you'll wind up with like wars and things.
Right. And this is, as I've been reflecting on this more, I theoretically see the value in being able to adopt it, but we've been discussing, I've seen the limitations of my own ability to access it. And, and thinking of it in more of a general terms in our population, and due to the evolutionary forces that prime us to more of the emotional form of empathy, it is a question that I have. How does the cognitive side of it become kind of instantiated in consciousness so that it's more accessible? It's not so clear to me how it can get reinforced. And I think that's where I think some holistic approaches to both dealing with the emotional side of empathy and getting familiar with what that dynamic is like, and also looking at ways that an environment can reinforce either the empathic or the sort of emotional or the cognitive side.
Mm-hmm.
It is a tall order, I think.
Yeah, no, it is. And I think it leads naturally to things like mindfulness. And I think a good concrete example, you were telling me this story about you had an encounter with a neighbor and a dog, which I think is illustrative of how challenging cognitive empathy is. Now, let me say, I'm aware that you asked me to diagnose the problem with the world and what is leading us to apocalypse and how to short circuit it. Let's promise to get back to that before the end of this conversation. But I think this is a fruitful thread because, so do you want to tell the tale of you and your neighborhood dog? You've just moved into a new neighborhood.
Yeah, I should give the context just a little bit. So it's pandemic, nearly out of an amicable divorce, but there's some tensions around that or emotional strife from that. Michael died, so that was a very hard hit. And the morning that we went live last week, I woke up, checked my phone, and found myself instantaneously in a family feud that I didn't plan on, the personal family stuff. And I put the phone down.
Not the same as this is your immediate family. This is not
the divorce situation. Okay. No, it was a sibling situation.
Yeah.
But I step out, start to walk my dog, and now I have this neighbor 3 doors up who has a little yappy dog that's never on leash. And sure enough, as I approached the driveway, the yappy dog came running out, charging at us, and I kind of charged at the dog, having had the proverbial straw hit my back, and I kind of went apoplectic for a short period of time. Charged at the dog, yelled at the dog, scared the dog away. But then I saw the owners standing there, and I started telling them in quite loud language that this was really bad. And I noticed that they were Asian, and I thought Chinese because I hear a lot of Mandarin in my neighborhood. And I started telling them in Mandarin how this was really bad. I had very rudimentary Mandarin from some time I lived in Taiwan. I could just tell them this was very, very bad, very, very expletive bad.
And how did he react?
Well, they all kind of froze, and I just sort of continued to walk on.
Well, they were probably blown away that you knew how to speak Chinese.
Well, and that's this thing is, as I've been thinking about it, I wonder if my ability to pull out the Chinese was a sign of my cognitive empathy coming on board. Because
it certainly distinguishes you from the average Caucasian in that neighborhood, I'm sure.
Who's losing their shit on the sidewalk.
Yeah.
But this is what I'm kind of getting. I mean, I'm using this as an example. I think what it's saying is it's sort of suggestive of the priming effect, which I think many people are feeling now. There's like the level of tension. The seawater is rising. We're feeling it. And then it just takes the slightest thing. And I think this is what your concern with China is, that it's, as tensions rise, you get to this and this. And then suddenly the slightest little mistake, like there's a naval error or an air collision. And as Kevin Rudd was just saying yesterday, and suddenly things blow up.
Now, I don't. Well, go ahead. Say anything more.
What do you want to?
Well, I was going to say, first of all, cognitive empathy is not some kind of miracle cure in all situations, and I don't have one in this case. But I would say it would be interesting to know and useful to know if you want to try to amend this guy's behavior in the future. Is it just that, like, he maybe he comes from a culture in which you kept dogs off leashes and he didn't know that this was the norm? Or is he like an asshole who just doesn't give a shit? And there are people like that. And it would just be useful to know that. But here's a thing about psychology, and it really applies both to this encounter with a Chinese American and with the whole thing with China, which is that, last time we spoke, I talked about this cognitive bias called attribution error. And one feature of it is that, I won't go into it all again, but one feature is that once you have defined someone as like an enemy, a rival, a problem, then whenever they do anything bad, anything you don't like, you are not going to seriously entertain the hypothesis that there's some circumstantial explanation that, oh, they just didn't know what the norms were, or they had a bad day or whatever. You're going to jump to the conclusion that that's just an asshole. That's just a bad person. And that's why in the case of China, like the more the kind of like Cold War fans succeed in framing China as bad, the harder it's going to get Americans to try to exercise cognitive empathy. Just look at things and like say, well, what is the perspective of the Chinese people? And what is the perspective of the leader? He's a politician. How's he looking at the world? All of which I think is useful. So I would say two things. And I mean, where mindfulness comes in, and you've been in a very mindful state, like day 8 on a meditation retreat, right? You know that when you're really in the mindfulness zone, you're not going to be as reactive, and you would be more amenable to asking the question like, I wonder, does he not know the norms? Is it this? Is it that? Now, it may be that your reaction was perfectly effective. That can happen. If he just didn't know the norms, that could work. But I'm just making the point that 2 points: that framing someone as the enemy, a rival, a bad person can shut off cognitive empathy and therefore reinforce the image of them as bad, lead you to exclude evidence that they're not bad by their nature, A, and then B, the virtue of mindfulness is it's more likely to keep the spigot of cognitive empathy open.
Right. With the idea of attribution error, would you agree that when the attribution bias, so the attribution error bias is in play, it skews someone's probability to project in a certain way consistently?
By project, you mean? Because
with the attribution, the person that's aggrieved is projecting blame, like a definitive. They're inferring a particular kind of intent on the actor. They're not taking into contextual elements that could be driving that person's behavior in a certain way. They're ascribing this kind of intent or agency around the action that's odious.
Yeah, it shuts you, it makes you less open to a particular kind of explanation of their motivation. Now, if it's a friend or ally, it works in reverse. If they do something bad, you're more likely to say, well, they didn't get their nap, or it was peer group pressure, or blah, 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 something circumstantial. They didn't know the rules of the road. They didn't know the norms. And if they do something good, then you're likely to say, yeah, they're good people. That's the kind of people they are. Again, if you define somebody as enemy or rival, it's the opposite. If they do something good, you go, oh, they're just like, they're showing off in front of this person or whatever. You dismiss it as circumstantial, situational in origin. The terms
you forgive it.
What's that?
You forgive it. You give them the benefit of the
doubt. Well, you forgive friends and allies,
right?
When they do bad things. But again, it isn't just that you forgive them. It's that you come up with a theory of their motivation that is conducive to forgiveness. Okay. The terminology in attribution error is situational or dispositional. Like if you see somebody who's rude at the checkout counter, do you say, oh, that's an asshole? That's a dispositional explanation. Or do you say, well, maybe they had a bad day? That's a situational explanation. And we are biased toward one or the other, depending on whether we are already putting somebody in the friend or enemy category. Okay, that's attribution error. And
I think we're now coming around to your non-zero thesis.
Okay.
Right?
Let me back up.
Because how you do, whether you see the person as friend or enemy, is often defined by the kind of game interaction that you're playing with them.
Yeah.
That's probably putting it too simply, but
yeah, and in fact, I mean, in a way,
because pause for a second, because let's do a recap of what zero-sum games are and what non-zero-sum games are, because
right.
there are probably some people that need a recap on that
Right, because
difference.
The plot spoiler is that I think cognitive empathy often helps you play non-zero-sum games to win-win outcomes. So a non-zero-sum game is a game that can have a win-win outcome or a lose-lose outcome. You know, a zero-sum game, like if you're playing tennis, every point is good for one player to the exact extent that it's bad for the other. So it's zero-sum. +1 for one player, -1 for the other. It always adds up to 0. But if you're playing doubles, your relationship to the person on your side of the net is entirely non-zero sum. So, and that's a purely non-zero sum situation. You will either both win or both lose. There are more complicated versions of non-zero sum games, but the main thing is that there can be win-win outcomes. There don't have to be win-lose outcomes. And I argue that, and there's all kinds of examples, like nuclear war is a non-zero sum game because you both lose. Two nuclear powers both lose. So winning, the win-win outcome is to not have the war. I maintain that understanding the situation of the other player in a nuclear standoff can help you realize a win-win situation. And in fact, the Cuban Missile Crisis is in a way an example. We now know that Kennedy did a secret deal with, I guess was it Khrushchev at the time, whoever it was, that Kennedy would remove missiles from Turkey, which Russia found threatening, if Russia or the Soviet Union at that time withdrew its missiles from the area of the vicinity of Cuba and didn't try to install missiles there. They kept it secret because they both understood. First of all, they both understood what was important to each one as a matter of politics and national security. They both understood that certain things couldn't become public, like the Soviet Union understood, or that Kennedy wouldn't want it known politically that he had pulled these missiles out of Turkey right away. They understood his political situation. So that's an example of how cognitive empathy can specifically help you solve a non-zero sum game. Now,
but can I interject for a second or question you? Is it your understanding or is your sense that through the evolutionary development of life that we are now sitting at the top of, is it your sense that there's been a kind of developmental transition from a higher percentage of zero-sum games being played in the world to more and more non-zero-sum games emerging? I sort of thought that was maybe, and that's maybe I should have read the book.
I would say, and I mean, this is a thesis of my book Non-Zero, is that there are a lot of zero-sum games in the world, and they're not all horrible, and they will always be with us. There is true competition, and that, but the argument is that as technology has evolved and kind of gotten us from hunter-gatherer village to the brink of forming a true global community, basically more and more people have found themselves in a non-zero-sum relationship with more and more people at greater remove. So, for example, a greater distance. So, if a car is manufactured with parts built all over the world, then there's a very complicated, in economic terms at least, non-zero sum game being played there, because various workers are getting paid and the consumer is getting something out of it, and so on. This is a good example of how attendant to non-zero sum game there can be zero sum games. So part of globalization is also low wage workers in one country competing with workers in another. And by the way, one of my arguments in non-zero is that you should address these kinds of things via a kind of global governance that is left leaning in some respects and doesn't shy away from getting into labor and environmental issues. But that aside, so at the end of the book, I'm emphasizing that there's all these non-zero sum games among nations. Climate change is a non-zero sum game. Either we all get together and do something about it, or we all lose. To oversimplify slightly, but not terribly. There's other environmental problems like this, various kinds of arms control problems, heading off pandemics. There's just tons of problems that either we get busy solving them, or the planet is in deep trouble. And I think collectively they constitute an existential threat. And I think one of the main impediments, not the only impediment, but is shortcomings of cognitive empathy and often it's like there are kind of what I would call bad actors trying to shut down our cognitive empathy and trying to demonize and villainize groups of people or nations or whatever in ways that ultimately impede the kind of cooperation you need to get the win-win outcome of the non-zero sum game. And the apocalypse, speaking not too facetiously, I mean, it's not literally like a biblical apocalypse, but the very, very bad planetary outcome would be letting all of these things spiral down into a lose-lose outcome. I think that is an existential threat to the planet.
Do you see the political situation in the United States it feels zero sum in terms of the polarization, but it also, I can see a way that there's a a non-zero nature to it too.
Yeah.
The outcome of the election will determine the direction, that the type of game that our administration is willing to play, in a certain sense.
Well, that is true. Yes. I mean, I guess I'd say, first of all, again, there are zero sum games, and and one thing I have encouraged is try to look at the world from the point of view of Trump supporters. I mean, abandon the idea that you can just say, well, they're all racists. And even if you think they are all racists, at least get interested in the question of how they became that way, right? Like, what kind of worldview and series of influences led the ones who are racist to be racist? And here I would say, there is a perception among a number of them that there is a non-zero sum game between some low-wage white workers and immigrants. Okay.
Do you mean zero sum? Do you see zero?
I'm sorry. I meant to say zero sum game. There is a zero sum game. That's the perception. It's not entirely crazy. Any economist will tell you that in the short term, although immigration can bring great benefits in the long run and in the short run, it can create competition for jobs that in the short run are finite. So, I mean, I guess I'd say what a politician like Trump does is he takes accurate perceptions of zero-sum dynamics and exploits them in a way that creates illusions about larger zero-sum dynamics, like convincing his supporters that like people like you and me have just complete contempt for them and really actively want to make their lives miserable. And this gets back to why I think that some of the resistance has been so counterproductive. It actually reinforces the idea that we have contempt for them. That's what Trump wants them to think. But ultimately, yeah, we are all in the same country, and there are a huge number of actual non-zero sum dynamics. And
let me just clarify for a second. Would you say then that zero sum dynamics have a greater tendency to amplify emotional empathy versus non-zero sum dynamics?
I actually think it's the opposite. I think the perception of a non-zero sum dynamic activates emotional empathy. Like if you if you see somebody and they're nice to you and you think you can do business with them, let's say you meet them on an airplane and you have a common interest and you can see how you might fruitfully collaborate. I think if they tell you some sad tale about one of their children being gravely ill, you're going to be more inclined to say, oh, not just say, but kind of feel, oh, I'm so sorry for you, you know? Whereas if it's like somebody you're identifying as an enemy, an asshole, I think that tends to shut down emotional empathy as well. Now, there are wrinkles to this. It can be more complicated, but I think often that's the case. Now, does that strike you as counterintuitive?
It did strike me as counterintuitive.
Does
I
it
mean,
still?
because if the, yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of something like where even with the example of tennis doubles, where I'm in a non-zero sum dynamic with my partner playing,
Mm-hmm.
you know, if we lose, it's the blame is distributed between me and the partner. So it's sort of, it doesn't hit me emotionally as bad as if I were, say, I mean, other factors could come into this, but if I'm playing a zero-sum game and I lose, it's entirely my fault. That would seem to have a more of a emotional valence than the shared loss. Maybe
Yeah, I would.
but I'm thinking about things like climate change, where, you know, it is a non-zero sum issue, and it seems so big that it doesn't activate the same like urgency that it should. And that's the biggest problem, I think, with the climate change issue, is that it's a sort of, it doesn't animate enough outcry. Like it's sort of it's somebody else's problem that's going to be figured out, kind of.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the thing about climate change, the big sticking point with climate change in America has nothing to do with empathy one way or the other. There are people who are not convinced that it's even in their own interest to solve the problem. They've been convinced that it's not a problem. There's also the fact that it's a long-term problem. It's like sacrifices we make today are not going to help us. They're going to help our kids. But even so, there are a lot of people who just think, who have been convinced that it's not a serious problem. And I don't think it's good to treat them with contempt and to call them deniers as opposed to skeptics, personally. I think that's going to impede persuasion. Deniers, to me, it evokes horrible, kinds of deniers. Whereas skeptics, but anyway, so I think that's not, I mean, here's the thing about to solve a lot of non-zero sum problems. It isn't that you need cognitive empathy, or emotional empathy in order to want to solve them. The point of a non-zero sum problem is it's in your interest to solve it. Okay. It's just that to solve it, you need to cooperate with other people. That's characteristic of non-zero sum problems. And sometimes not understanding where they're coming from can get in the way of the cooperation. Or to get back to China, shutting down the cognitive empathy, as well as, we can get back to emotional empathy, but shutting down cognitive empathy could lead to such estrangement that no cooperation on any of these global problems is realistic for decades. That's my concern.
So you wanted to talk about Trump supporters, and I've heard you do this before, and the thing that I think needs to be teased out is that developing cognitive empathy for a Trump supporter is not the same as defending their position or capitulating ceding your position. And I think that's the thing that it emotionally rubs me whenever I try to do that. I feel like, oh, if I'm going to open up to consider what their experience is, then it feels like a loss of something with me.
It's funny, when I used to write in the early part of the aughts, arguing that like the reason we had a terrorist problem is because we kept like bombing other countries and stuff, I would get blowback from the right. Ann Coulter said I had sympathy for terrorists because I was just explaining their behavior. I wasn't trying to defend it. I was just telling you, if you want to put it into the terrorism, maybe you should think seriously about what causes it, And basically, just about every Islamic extremist who has ever shot up anywhere in America has said, I'm doing this because you're killing Muslims in Afghanistan or Iraq or somewhere. And that was, so in that case, it was the right who was saying, oh, to explain is to excuse, it's a famous French expression, to know all is to forgive all. And that does capture something about human nature. Okay. It is a natural tendency. The more you understand people to be willing to forgive them. But I encourage everyone to just put that intuition on hold. Try to separate the processes of explanation and like exoneration or adjudication or whatever. Just put aside the question of whether you're going to wind up deciding they're to blame, they should be punished, whatever, and allow yourself to explore what seems to be the most plausible explanation for behavior without worrying about that stuff. Anyway, to complete the circle, now when I say, let's look at the root causes of Trumpism, just as I used to say, let's look at the root causes of terrorism, I get the blowback from the left. And I'm making the same argument in both cases. If you have something you don't like, try to understand why it's happening.
And the reason you want to understand why it's happening
is so you can do something about it.
Something other than
how you'll have to fill in that sentence for me.
Well,
you're not successfully leading the witness here, or I'm a dumb witness.
Well, no. It's the emotional reactivity that is the alternative action.
Yeah, rather than just reacting. I mean, think, reflect, and do something. And this is a very, very Buddhist, as you know. I mean, there's a lot of emphasis in Buddhism on skillful action, which involves like suspension of judgment, right?
So I hear an argument forming in my head, let's play devil's advocate, that sounds like it's not necessarily sort of forgiving, but if there's a boot at your neck, or there's a boot on your neck, which many people feel that this administration is effectively doing, it's hard to just sit back and not take a more heated response.
Well, if there's literally a boot on your neck, I don't recommend sitting back. But I mean, that's the thing. There are times when, upon reflection, you'll realize radical action is in order. I mean, but even then, it should be, you should reflectively reach that conclusion. And I just think, look, another good example of this is, well, I won't get I won't dig myself any deeper with card carrying resistance members, but I thought there was a certain amount of reactivity about the Russiagate thing that wasn't healthy. I mean, I think it's still possible that there is a smoking gun somewhere there. I always thought it's possible, and I don't think we can rule that out. But I also thought all along, the evidence that everyone's seizing on gleefully is not itself determinative. And if we spend too much time and energy accusing him of being a Manchurian candidate, and the accusation isn't corroborated solidly in the end, we may regret having done it. And I think some people think it was not time and energy well spent. But and that was, I think in some ways that was reactive and not reflective enough. And
in terms of Trump supporters, what you're advocating of, what on your end, what would that actually look like? In looking at what's animating or motivating or giving rise to their position, what would you start to see? What kind of variables or conditions would you tease out in that analysis?
You mean, what's my theory of the case in terms of what does motivate Trump supporters?
Right. Because this is obviously probably going to an audience that is less populated with the Trump supporters. who
possibly
presumably could engage with kind of this cognitive exercise you're advocating.
Well, I think first of all, it's not just one thing. To think of all Trump supporters as like a whole is a kind of essentialism.
Right. They're not a homogeneous blob.
Yeah. And as you know, Buddhism is kind of against essentialism in a number of senses of the word. But including this, I mean, it's just a simplistic view. And I should say, and look, if people, and maybe this helps explain why I seem so intent on understanding Trump supporters. 3 of my 4 siblings voted for Trump. And did your eyes open wider when I said that? Yeah.
Slightly.
And they were motivated by different things. Okay. One of them hates the Clintons. That above all else, both Clintons, not just Hillary.
Is that because Bill liked your book Non-Zero?
I don't think so. I doubt he even knows that Bill liked my book Non-Zero, but another is like an evangelical homeschooler. Abortion is a huge issue. There's that. So it's a lot of different things. I do think, more than people realize. I think one thing is true of people generally is they want to think of themselves as good, right? So if you imagine like the average Trump supporter is sitting there fuming, using the N-word and all these pejoratives for Latinos or whatever, maybe I'm naive, but I think a whole lot of them are not doing that. I think people want to think of themselves as good people. That said, I think a lot of them are still, they are. Some of them feel insecure about the fate of white people, and they would say they don't think that's racism. They would say, look, but the main thing is I think it's a lot of little things, and I think at a minimum, just understanding the narrative that Trump is deploying helps you not fall into the trap of reinforcing the narrative. It's like, I'd settle for that. And I do think the resistance has gotten a little better. I think it was worse at the beginning when people would just make these flat pejorative generalizations about Trump supporters. But I still think that more than we realize, a lot of the clickbaity anti-Trump headlines and so on reinforce Trump's narrative about the media being biased against him. A lot of little things reinforces his narrative. But look, we'll know soon enough whether this particular nightmare will have passed. And I don't. So we've been at this an hour. I really want to thank people who have actually stuck with this and actually shown up for live stream. And while you think of anything else you may want to talk about, I'm going to glance at the comments, which in theory could be useful if I was dexterous enough to like carry on a conversation while looking at comments. You could
that's what I'm wondering. Should I be scrolling through the feed and picking up?
I don't know, but I want to reassure people. Wait, is that Mark Ambinder? The Mark Ambinder? He's a journalist. Is that? And I may be pronouncing your name wrong, Mark. Anyway, I'm just glancing. We will read all these, and people should also. There are other ways to communicate with us if they want to weigh in on. And anybody who listens to this later, watches it later on YouTube, listens. On the podcast, you can email at non-zero. The email address is nonzero.news@gmail.com. If you put like Josh Summers in the subject heading or something, that will distinguish it. It'll make it easier for me to find. I can just, because there are different kinds of email that show up there. You could tweet at me either at Robert Writer or at Darwin Dharma, which is my like kind of Buddhist feed, and you are at Middle Way Josh, the way it sounds on Twitter. But are there? It's 9:01, and people are maybe heading off to watch the Democratic convention shortly. Are there other things? I find this conversation very fruitful. I realize it's a little self-indulgent in that I did more than 50% of the talking. But are there other things you wanted to say or thoughts you have about where this might head?
I guess I've just been, if I take your thesis at face value that cognitive empathy would be a good thing, I do feel like we're up against this very fast, to use the thinking fast and slow model of mental processes. We're dealing with a very fast emotional gut system that I think is quite hard to overcome and transcend.
Yeah.
And then that just sort of reinforces and skews perception and really can make it quite hard to take on that leap of, well, what is going on with them, or why are they doing this? I think the ways that I've found it helpful to develop, I think, more cognitive empathy is to look more, to contextualize and to step off the individual. So if it's a person in a family, rather than looking at them and assigning blame to their behavior, I might try to look at more of the systemic issue in the family and even intergenerational dynamics in the family that cause a certain kind of trauma or development to continue and perpetuate. And when I do that, then the person or the group that's bugging me is not so much the loathed agent, but they're more of a symptom of a systemic dysfunction.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that could also sound patronizing. I don't mean it that way. It's just, I find it a more helpful way to try to look at things. Than essentializing, as you're saying, essentializing the other.
I would say it's another sense in which, it's not cognitive empathy per se, because you're not just asking yourself, well, how does this person look at the world? You're asking how they came to be earlier forces shaped them. But what that has in common with cognitive empathy is explaining how they came to be doing what they're doing. And that in turn can affect emotional empathy. It can make it easier to sympathize with them if they've been doing things that are annoying you. And the whole interaction between cognitive empathy and emotional empathy is interesting, can work in both ways. And it also, by the way, raises a challenge you presented. Like, wait a second, are you saying that in explaining, to explain it at the system level is to absolve them of responsibility for their behavior? I'm sure you get that. But
it does make you think about how you treat it.
Yeah.
How you address it. Think of just something like addiction. Addiction itself. It tends to be ascribed to blaming the individual for sort of deficits that get them hooked and this and that. But obviously, there's so many contextual issues that predispose someone and condition someone to take that track.
Yeah. On the point you made about how complicated it is to avoid reacting in the moment. If we continue these conversations, we'll need to spend time on social media and actual techniques, for not getting drawn into it in an unhealthy way, or a way that leads you to be too reactive. But all these things I'm saying are easy to preach and not necessarily easy to practice.
Did you ever see that? I don't know why this is popping in my head, but did you ever see those ad busters? I don't know if it was a magazine filled with them, or if it was just occasional ads that they really juxtapose two things against each other in such a way it snapped you into a different way of seeing.
I don't think I did. I'm trying to think if that was the thing that was somehow connected to the Occupy movement. Seems like early on, the opponents of the Occupy movement tried to condemn it by virtue of its association with something. And I was thinking Adbusters was it. But anyway, I don't know them, no.
Well, when you were talking about how to engage in social media in a way to tweak more cognitive empathy, it seemed like that might be a convention that could be used. So something similar, drawn from how they were juxtaposing things and kind of making you really think about sort of an ironic twist, or helping you see it from a different perspective that breaks up kind of the illusion that you've been spellbound by.
I will. I'll
have to look it up.
Send me stuff. I'll take a look.
It's been ages since I've looked at it. But the other thought I had, though, is that when you do take a more systemic look and see, one of the tenets of Buddhism, as we both know, is that nothing arises independently. It's this doctrine of dependent origination, that there is no entity that is independently existing. And in terms of our experience of distress, and particularly this self-generated distress, which I think is you're getting as this like unforced errors of overreaction that lead to less optimal outcomes or less optimal engagement. That self-generated distress is diagnosed as arising due to an ignorant view or an inability to comprehend and accurately see what's occurring.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I think the mindfulness piece comes in, is that it starts to help, or at least it attempts to help, take a more sober, objective, leaning perspective on what's going on, rather than having the filter of the emotional empathy be the driver.
Oh, totally. I mean, in a number of senses. I mean, first of all, mindfulness can give you an apprehension of what you described, the interconnectedness of it all. It can even make you appreciate the kind of porousness of the bounds of, quote, the self, have more of a sense of how you are, kind of integrated with various influences impinging on you. But also, yeah, just gives you the ability to reflect on when it's working. And like many things, it's easy to talk about, not necessarily easy to practice.
Well, I will say, after I blew up at the owners of the little white dog, it was only 3 steps. I felt mortified.
Yeah,
absolutely mortified. I was like, holy, what did I do? That was ridiculous. And I am still, I have to brush up on my Chinese, but I will be issuing a hand-delivered apology at some point.
well, that's great. I mean, it would be so cool if you had an actual conversation in Chinese with them. Yeah, if this were the movie, we know it would end with them having tea in your apartment.
Dumplings.
Yes.
Baozi.
So, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot here. So, but mindfulness, yeah, it can give you the ability to observe the feelings that are about to get you to do something before they get you to do it, and in principle, and it's happened with me. It doesn't always happen, unfortunately, but it has happened to allow you to engage more selectively with your feelings in a certain sense. And that's misleading, but to decide whether you want to be led by them. Some feelings are great. Love being led by them.
Sure.
Don't hurt the world. It's great. So
if
do
it
you
feels
think,
right.
So it seems to me it would be fun to have a third conversation and maybe work on coming up with like kind of applied examples, maybe from the news of that week and or our own lives or something. And
and I also think what we want to encourage is audience participation, feedback, questions, points for clarification.
Absolutely.
That kind
if
of
you
thing.
write them in this YouTube column to the right of the screen right now, we will see them. If you send them to nonzero.news@gmail.com, we will see them. If you tweet at either of us, we will see them. And if we don't have time to answer and just like them, rest assured we read them, took them seriously. I guess we need to talk. I think we both, my own view on live streaming is I don't totally understand the virtues of it. In a way, it makes me nervous. And so maybe
I had a thought about that on my walk today.
What's your thought?
Do you watch sports?
Yeah, too much.
Do you watch recorded games or live games?
Almost always recorded.
So you're one of those
they're
guys.
Still going on, but I join them early. So, I join them late so I can skip commercials or something.
I don't watch recorded games. Somehow knowing it's already done, it's like, it just loses all pizzazz.
So that's a virtue of the live stream. Even though the fact is, in our last live stream, a large majority of people did watch it later, which is good that there was a large majority show up. But I think it's kind of cool. I think it'd be cooler if I did get better at like actually looking at comments and maybe responding in real time.
There's got to be a formula for that. I think it must have like an iPad screen on the side we can scroll through. I think that would be
the problems are in my brain, not in the technological apparatus. I'm not good at multitasking, but and we don't have like a producer who highlights the comments and shows us one, anyway, should we so we agree, you're game for one more conversation, in which
Sure.
case the question is it a live stream? I think we agreed earlier that if it is, it needs to be Wednesday next week at 8 instead of Thursday.
Right.
Should we do
is
that?
ballroom dancing on Thursdays for you now?
It's no, but for various reasons, it's better for me to
That's fine. Wednesday
not
works.
be doing. Yeah. So should we agree on that, or should we just tell people to check out our Twitter feeds? No, let's just say we'll do it. Okay. Wednesday at 8, and then we will know more about the future of these, whether the future exists, whether they'll be on live stream and so on. But as of but so that's Wednesday, the 26th of August at 8.
Michael Brooks, smash the like button.
As Michael Brooks says, smash that YouTube like button. And yeah, special shout out to his fans.
Yes.
And I hope we have done him justice. So thank you, Josh.
Yeah, thanks, Bob.
I guess the way you end a live stream is to click end, right?
Yeah, if you don't click in. Yeah, we got to give a good farewell to everybody. Great to have you. Appreciate your presence.
Thank you. And I'm even going to write that in the YouTube column after after I click end. I'm gonna go that far, and that's how conversant I am in this live streaming technology. So
this is the second round.
So I'll see you Wednesday. I hope you've had another encounter with your neighbor by then.
I'll update you then.
Make it happen.
Okay.
Okay. See you around.
Take care.
Bye-bye.